Hi guys, it's Steffi from the Novelty Corner and welcome back to my Psy-Changeling review series. I'm going to be talking about Book 2, Visions of Heat today. For those of you who are unaware, this is a paranormal romance series by Nalini Singh. It is very detailed, very intricate and spans 19 books or so. So we are currently right back at the beginning, and reading this book actually made me remember quite a few little details that had been planted very early on that I'd completely forgotten about. I will leave a link on the screen to my first video which goes into a lot of the details about the world building. I'm not going to do too much of that today except where it's relevant to moving the overarching plot forward. So be aware of that. I'm not going to try and explain all of that every single time, otherwise that would get quite repetitive and quite boring. In Visions of Heat, we are following one of the Dark River Sentinels, Vaughn D'Angelo, who is a Jaguar shifter, and it is his relationship with Faith Nightstar, who is a Psy who can foresee the future. I'm not going to hold the book up the whole time. It's going to get very annoying to do that. I'm going to start off with a basic summary of the story and then some really interesting plot things that came up in this book for me that I'd completely forgotten about. So we open up the book with Faith, who is living her life. She is employed by one of the Psy clans, the Nightstar clan, who are very involved in business, and her job is to make economic predictions for different Psy clans and Psy businesses, and she's the best foreseer that they have. So she brings in a lot of money for people, and as such she also makes a lot of money for herself. But we quickly come to realize that although she is very good at her job, there are some drawbacks to being a foreseer in that she can get lost in her visions, and sometimes that means she might forget to eat or take breaks or whatever. So she's very closely monitored because she's seen as a prized commodity. Faith lives in this compound house that's on the edge of the city and the wooded area where the Dark River Sentinels sort of patrol, and she's constantly monitored throughout the house, although she's the only one in there, but she's constantly monitored, and the only place where she has any sort of freedom is her bedroom because she insisted on not having any monitoring devices in there. So it's a very secluded, isolated life for her because she's been told that foreseers go crazy if they go out into the real world or if they're exposed to too many people because they get so much information. Vaughn stumbles across this compound and is very intrigued by it. He sort of feeds back information to his pack about the fact that the compound exists and tries to find out from Sasha who could possibly be living in there, and she begins to wonder whether it could be Faith because Faith is quite well known as a foreseer. And also at the same time that all of this is happening, the Psy Council is beginning to look at a replacement counsellor for the counsellor who was killed at the end of the previous book, and Faith's name comes up at this stage as one of the possible candidates. Eventually Faith has had enough of living in this life, and so she tells everyone she's not to be disturbed for 3 days, and she actually escapes her own house and goes off in search of Sasha Duncan because she's heard rumours that a Psy has managed to break from the Psy net, and Faith is very concerned that her powers are starting to degrade and that she's starting to potentially go crazy, which is something that happens to the foreseers. And so she escapes, and as she's heading into Dark River territory, she obviously comes across Vaughn, who then eventually takes her to meet Sasha and Lucas. It's a very tentative, hesitant start because obviously they don't trust her. She's still connected to the Psy net. She's a possible threat to them, and she's also someone who pushes Vaughn's buttons, and he's very, very intrigued by her, and he keeps pushing her boundaries, which is the one thing about this book that I perhaps didn't particularly like, is that she repeatedly says that she needs to go much slower, and he keeps trying to push that, to push her past it. And in some ways, yes, it's helpful for her character development, but also at the same time, no means no. What we find out is that, so we discover that along with all of these economic visions that Faith has been having, she's also started having these darker visions about death. She actually foresaw her half-sibling's murder, and she didn't realize that that was what it was at the time. And then she realizes she's starting to see the thoughts of a killer, and that's where Sasha steps in to try and help her understand what it is that she's seeing and how to control it a little bit, because prior to all of this, all of her predictions have been directed by the Psy clan, so that she's seeing only what they want her to try and see, as opposed to things that might just come naturally to a foreseer. Faith spends a little bit of time going backwards and forwards between her compound and the Dark River territory. She's also approached by a couple of the counsellors, Shoshana and also Nikita, to test her suitability for being a potential council member. And eventually when she is called in to speak to the council, she tells them to basically withdraw her name because she actually realizes that she has been put forward as a way to test another one of the candidates to see what that candidate will do in order to get to the top, i.e. potentially take out Faith. And she says, no, don't want anything to do with that. Leave me out of it. You play your own political games. Faith then has some contact with her father, and of all the Psy parents, her father, Anthony Kyriakis, actually behaves a little bit more like a parent in this, and there's really subtle hints in this book as to the fact that he may not quite be what everyone thinks he is. And he contacts Faith, lets her know that she's got a target painted on her back because of her nomination for the council, and he proposes to keep her in lockdown to keep her safe. And he initially argues for 12 months and she argues it down to 3 months, and that's when she makes the decision to actually leave. She doesn't come back this time. She actually gets out that night. She has acknowledged that Vaughn is her mate, and the two begin their relationship in earnest, and it's sort of touch and go for a little while as Faith is processing everything that's going on. She has another one of those really dark visions, and she realizes that she's actually seen the face of the man who is doing all of these killings. Faith and Vaughn take this information to the Dark River Sentinels, as well as Judd, who is a Psy who is working with the Snowdancer clan, and they put a plan into motion to completely disable this Psy because he's killing rather indiscriminately at this point. After that is done, there is another attempt on Faith's life, this time from one of the Psy Council members who decides to take Faith out because she's left the net, she's dropped out, and she's just no longer making predictions for them. But this is really quickly undermined by the rest of the council, who decide to leave her alone because her value in being able to foresee the future is far more profitable for them than if they actually completely disable her. And Anthony comes back to her with a counter proposal that she subcontract back to the Night Star clan. So even though she's no longer part of the Psy and she's no longer part of the Night Star clan, she can still work for them, and she will get a much bigger cut of all of the profits that she generates, which works out quite well for her. There are a few sort of romantic storylines in this series that are not my favorite, and this is one of them. But what I came to realize as I was going through and reading this book was how much Nalini Singh sets up in this book for everything else that happens. So where Slave to Sensation was a setup for the world, this really sets up a lot of those little smaller threads that just come in and out of every book going forward. The first one being the storyline of Caleb Krychek, who is the other Psy that is put forward to be a member of the Psy Council. He's the youngest member of the Psy Council. I think he's only 27 in this. He's portrayed to be this quite mysterious character who has a tendency to take out his opponents in anything that he's doing. And so this is the first time that we really see him being talked about, and this is where he actually joins the council. And even though she was his opponent at the end, Caleb is one of the people to actually put aside any notion of taking Faith out of the equation at the end of the book. So he's got his own sort of long-term game plan to come, and I know that because I've read the books, but this is where it really starts to sort of embed itself into the main narrative. It's also the introduction of Anthony Kyriakis, who does come back to play a role in subsequent books, and I really do hope at some point he gets his own book because he's quite an interesting Psy in that he does have close contact with his children, even if it's not in the same familial way that you would expect a father and a child to behave. He does genuinely care about Faith, and he listens to her when she makes suggestions, and when she leaves the Psy net, he's very, very supportive of her, and he wants to stay connected with her afterwards, which is sort of similar but also very different to Sasha's relationship with her mother, Nikita. We also discover in this book that Sasha has begun training the Dark River Sentinels how to shield her own psychic abilities, because she is connected to all of them through the feedback web that keeps her alive, and now also Faith is part of that network. But she also understands that they don't necessarily want her or Faith knowing everything that's going on, so she has been training them. And not just the Sentinels, but also Tamsin, who is the healer for the pack as well. We also spend a lot more time with the Netmind in this book because Faith begins communicating with the Netmind. Now, in later books, other characters spend a lot of time with the Netmind, which is sort of this sentient being that lives on the Psy-net and is just part of the fabric of the Psy-net. But we begin to learn a little bit more about it. And I'd forgotten this part. Part of the reason why Faith's name was put forward as a potential council member was because in order to keep the netmind happy or to communicate with it or to keep it in check, they really needed a high-level telekinetic or a high-level foreseer, because those are the two Psy designations that have the best relationships with the netmind. This is also the first book where we find out a little bit about the Psy Arrows, who are the soldiers for the Psy race. And it's also the first time that we find out that Judd Lauren was an Arrow as well, and he's outed by Faith, who figures it out. She puts 2 and 2 together and sort of outs him. I mean, he doesn't confirm it, but she recognizes that that's probably what his job was before he left the Signet. And then she's also the one to propose that they use his specific skill set in order to take out the murderer. So it's interesting how all of these plots sort of get woven together. So I think initially when I read this book, I gave it a 3-star rating overall, and this time I bumped it up to a 4, I think because I recognised more of the world building elements that Nalini Singh had woven into the story, and I'd forgotten how much crucial information is implanted in this book. So while the relationship side of it was not my favourite, the actual story itself and where it sets up this world to go is really interesting. And there are a whole lot of sort of characters who were just mentioned that I've added to my little lists that haven't yet come up in other books, but I'm curious to see if there is perhaps if they do show up again later on. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. So in terms of my little checklist of ratings, for engagement, I was very engaged in the book, 4 out of 5. Atmosphere, 4 out of 5 as well. Heart is probably like a 3 out of 5. Humor, I didn't find it particularly funny, so that's probably like a 2. And the heat factor, the heat in the story is probably like 3, 3.5. It doesn't really come into sort of the very tail end of this particular book. But overall, I did really enjoy it. I'm glad I went back and reread it, because at the moment I only go back and reread certain books with the characters that I absolutely adore. But to go back and to see where everything fits in and where everything started, because there's a lot of information I take for granted now. So that's going to be really interesting to take note of as I move forward in the story. So yes, that was Visions of Heat. Hopefully I was relatively coherent for the most part. In the comments below, let me know if you have read the Psy-Changeling series or if you've read this book. I would love to hear your thoughts. I hope that wherever you're in the world, you are doing really well, and I will catch you guys in my next video. Bye guys.